World War I can be seen as the start of the modern age. It allegedly put lie to the phrase dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Countless wrote vivid memoirs of suffering, most famously the book All Quiet on the Western Front, which in 2022 was adopted into a movie. Mars was surely dead, war buried. It had been the war to end all wars, and no one would ever die in a muddy field again. Yet, even in this most horrible static war, a different vision emerged for some. King of these was Ernst Junger, a legendary man who wrote one of the greatest memoirs in history. I saw him running through a gap in the hedge. I aimed my pistol and fired. He stumbled, turned sideways and fell, rolled over once more, and then lay still. I was astonished at how fast he dropped, and at the same time, I was gripped by a savage excitement. There is a peculiar thrill in shooting someone. It is something like the excitement of the hunter. You are no longer a man, but a machine that operates with cold precision. It strikes me that one of our highest social taboos is violence and its relationship with power. We speak rarely of the effects it has, on the role it plays, on how pervasive it is. Yet, it seems to surround us, irrevocably linked with all stories of heroism and human passion, but also malice and corruption. It is the untouched assumption that underlies all things. In his controversial book, On Killing, David Grossman tried to demystify violence by presenting its real psychological costs and arguing for, essentially, an open conversation about the cost of war. What Grossman was pointing out, and what I feel at pains here to underline, was the deep psychological toll of violence on the human mind and the paradoxes it works within. Above all else, what strikes me is that this toll does not come immediately, but comes in the form of a cycle of self-doubt. One of the things that appears to occur among men in combat is that they feel the high of the exhilaration stage, and then, when the remorse stage sets in, they believe that there must be something wrong or sick about them to have enjoyed it so intensely. The common response is something like this: "My God, I just killed a man and I enjoyed it. What is wrong with me?" They feel bad that they don't feel bad. But there is absolutely nothing wrong with them. Indeed, among mature warriors, among individuals who have mentally and emotionally prepared themselves for combat, this is one of the most common reactions. Here, we see an interesting suggestion. The pain that killing brings comes often precisely from the absence of immediate regret, or even the presence of enjoyment. It is a personal feeling, stemming principally from proximity, hence the surprising observation that bombers rarely experience the same levels of PTSD as frontline soldiers. Notably, the psychological stress of killing is so great that throughout history, only a small proportion of soldiers was said by Grossman to shoot to kill. For various reasons, this is controversial, but the trauma created in combat and the complex relationship to it are very real. So, what does one do with soldiers? We could take a page from history books. Throughout history, soldiers were purified through ritual after war, and were regarded as possessing high social status and honor. This, after all, is the role of statues and monuments given to both the fallen and the living. Notably, after World War II, men were brought back in pomp and circumstance, experienced a steady journey, giving them time to process their deeds, and a victory parade in their local community. Further, they were placed in a respected space, and on the whole, given reverence for their experiences. It is telling how social ritual, status, and environment play a role in reintegrating the warrior. Contrast this with Vietnam. Soldiers returned, frequently to be spat at, from a war that was essentially futile, and with the American government taking very limited and largely ineffective action to reintegrate veterans. Deep resentment existed between citizens and soldiers, with the former being swept up in a tide of biased media coverage, most notably a severe lapse of duty and bad coverage of the Tet Offensive and Saigon execution, entailing a heinous manipulation where a photo was shown without context of a Viet Cong being executed, with the implication that he was a civilian, whilst he had in fact just killed a police officer with his entire family. Soldiers were often proclaimed baby killers, and poor handling in the field, like insufficient rest time and serious issues with equipment, most notably the frequently jamming M16, left many traumatized and embittered. So, given the lessons of Vietnam, why can't we just bring back rituals? Give soldiers respect? Of course, such an ask resembles asking the homeless to simply buy houses. True faith is required for these matters, as is placing soldiers in a certain context of respect and honor. This is a matter of mindset. To understand our society's inadequacy, we must confront and understand the various issues that come with killing, its use, and the relationship of a ruling elite to these things. We are ruled today by a managerial elite whose worldview is liberal in persuasion, and here I mean in terms of Weltanschauung. These types, who I will call managerial neoliberals, are incapable of any reverence for a sense of sanctity, operating wholly in the key of numbers and charts. Jonathan Haidt analysed political beliefs like these in terms of moral foundations. A conservative, he noted, has about an equal amount of focus on each moral foundation, while liberals reject three key foundations: loyalty betrayal, authority subversion, and sanctity degradation. This is a society of people who idealize consent, but find no limit to what degrading and disgusting acts are justifiable. It is this worldview only that allows them to have an essentially utilitarian approach to reduce man to a number. This, I think, is the cause of much malady in our world, and significant mental illness, including our poor understanding and relationship with primal violence. It strikes me as natural that this worldview is doomed to fail. When a man is reduced to a comfortable box, he will smash up his luxuries, if only to feel more human. Whatever the case may be, to such an elite, accepting the need for ritual is akin to a Christian accepting the devil himself into his household. The elite deny the will to violence, because violence is an active matter, unpredictable and chaotic. It is best put in a box, studied at a distance, perhaps in the form of logistics, but certainly not in terms of actual competition and will. Besides, to accept the intrinsic link that exists between primal violence and human will would destroy the soapbox of liberalism, the myth of choice, and a participatory society. It is always the case that any ideological regime will over time face more and more the weight of its own contradictions, until the action that need be taken is obvious to all, but acceptable to none. Historical order can eventually only be preserved by rejecting its essential characteristics. That, at least, is my view on history and ideology, or what makes it cyclical. Like an Ouroboros, ideas themselves have embedded in them the seeds of their own demise. And that unravelling represents the primordial link between violence and power, for all worldviews must ultimately assert themselves. This is the weakness of our elite, and I think the principal reason for the malignment of soldiers. Soldiers, after all, represent an active element in a passive age. Most illuminating, in my view, is the work of Georges Sorel. Sorel is one of those strange figures who, like Hegel, do not fit neatly into any part of the ideological bubble. At the foundations of fascism and socialism, he argued a rather fascinating point. While much of his book is about the evolution of communist social movements and trade union-employer relation, he also emphasizes the importance of the heroic in societal change. The heroic implies the pre-existence of myth, with this calling to eternal values, which must be based on something that is not simply here and now, but that calls to eternal action. Such a myth, which is actionable and hence violent, insofar as violence is the enforcement of one's will on another, is a consolidating force for revolutionary movement. Mind you, he distinguishes his sort of proletarian violence from the middle-class violence of, say, the French Revolution. To him, this new sort of violence would be targeted and narrow. It represents more a movement of a state of will, or Napoleonic grand battle, rather than the personal and spiteful terror characterized by the bourgeois alternative. We'll put aside these conceptions as, while interesting, they may obscure the point. Sorel's view of violence is idealistic, contrasting markedly with a pure materialist theory. For Sorel, positive violence emerges as a consequence of the heroic, stemming from myth. Sorelian myth is an ideology brought to reality, must contain not just the fundamental elements of a movement, but critically, it must contain in itself both immediacy and actionability. The myth must also echo the structure of the movement, aspire to the same thing, and be complete in said structure. For Sorel, this was the syndicalist general strike, for which he stated, "Not only are all its, that is, socialism's, real elements found therein, but they are moreover grouped in the same way as in social struggles, and their movements are exactly those proper to their nature." Sorel's reflections are filled with active language. He abhors the parliamentary, who fears the loss of his privilege and leans into passive approaches, especially accelerationism. He points, I think rightly, to early Christianity, which as a movement called for total faith and crafted an immediate myth in the 1st century, the second coming of Jesus Christ. Christians believed this would mark the destruction of the world and the oppressive Roman Empire. Interestingly, Sorel notes that the Church does best when it is most absolute and threatened by external forces, noting, in the course of the 19th century, Catholicism recovered strength to an extraordinary degree because it would abandon nothing. It even strengthened its mysteries, and, what is very curious, it gained ground in cultivated circles where rationalism, which was formerly in fashion at the university, is scoffed at. However, when the Church compromises, and especially when it is brought into the temporal world, it suffers. In this sense, the great threat to it is decadence, which I believe has largely possessed the modern soul. The middle class is in a state of degradation, both in economy and faith, as it sees declining influence, worse prospects for work, and in general a reduced energy due to any number of social crises. Low fertility, alienation, and mental illness come to mind as great apocalyptic horsemen. The heroic and mythical emerge as obvious solutions. To embrace these, we must go beyond the approximations of rationalists, the sort of people who struggle to answer why anyone would die in a war. Totalizing notions, such as glory or faith, are key, and we must embrace them in a way that calls us to action. The managerial elite can have no answer to our ills. They serve only pre-packaged solutions generated in consulting companies. If you ever get the chance to talk to people from top investment banks or consulting companies, know that they rarely have any grounding in history or the world as is. They package solutions and services in a way that is ultimately mechanical and meaningless. These, of course, have no relation to the personhood of their subjects. Man is reduced to a mere cog. I fear, though, that this is a spectre that also haunts the right. In an attempt to understand the power structures that are, which in itself is a good thing, we have essentially embraced a sort of mechanical thought. This approach comes from the so-called realist right. These are people, most notably academic agent, who draw inspiration in large part from the Machiavellians, Moscow, Pareto, and Michels. They argue the world should be understood through elite theory, different sections of the elite competing for castles, representing centers of power largely in shows of cynical calculation. Elites are also split in two types, lions and foxes, with ratios depending on the point in civilization you are in. Foxes use largely guile, and lions use force to maintain the system. Without a doubt, our elite represents a fox elite, manipulating rather than abusing. Interestingly, it is quite questionable in the elitist paradigm whether lion rule can emerge out of fox rule, as asabaya, tribal vitality, when lost, cannot be easily rediscovered. The key with Machiavellians is that the why of power becomes secondary, merely a justification. In the words of AA, all justifying ideology is merely blah blah blah, therefore we rule. They would not, of course, deny the limiting factors or importance of ideology once it exists, but say that it exists as an imposition and result of power, to retroactively justify it. Notably, the lions, as an elite, usually emerge as a result of conquest. An example would be the conquest of a state by a group of barbarians. Such an act was pointed to by Cousin Alemario, also known as BAP, as the foundation point of the modern political state, when pastoralists conquered groups of agrarian societies and established aristocracies concerned, for reasons to be explained in the future, with breeding. I would posit, however, that such a view is reductive, that it bypasses the human spirit. To be clear, I appreciate it perfectly as an analytical method, but to be a believer in the primacy of elite theory is in my view foolish. Ideologies have real physical impacts on the world, and our beliefs ought to be conditioned on what good actually is. I posit that realism often fails to see true belief can act as both a barrier and a force multiplier. The soldier does not charge forward because he believes his side to have some force advantage. As another example, part of the cause of German military excellence were their very real ideas on a war of movement, also known as Bewegungskrieg, which emerged from broader German worldviews, and what Cetino called a German way of war. This involved precisely disregarding calculation in favor of instinct, attack, and bravery. Realism has a tendency to capture fixed states in time and fail to see social orders as creatures of motion that can be influenced by bravery. In tactics, a man guided by realism will be prone to moderation when none is advisable, for the sake of, for example, coalition building, forsaking the real moral effects of faith. This ideology also encourages only passivity and action on a small scale. These actions certainly can be useful. Real-life meetings of good men will be a key part of moving to the future. But eventually, they will have to be surpassed. History is not just a calculation of means and ends that dooms us to failure and passivity. We require fanaticism and ideological depth that is not skin deep, for all else would be capitulation to matter and formula. One of the great villains of history, Joseph Stalin, proves an interesting illustration. He was a man who, in some sense, had a masterful understanding of violence inherent in society. He started out, after all, as essentially a thug who was known for multiple robberies and acts of violence in the 1910s. Later, he ascended to leadership over the Soviet Union. Make no mistake about the savagery of this man. When asked about the Pope, his only response was to inquire about the number of divisions he commanded. He led a state that utilized torture and coercion on a truly mass scale. A telling anecdote was that he asked Marshal Rokossovsky, an understated hero of the Soviet Union, whether he had been tortured. Rokossovsky replied yes, he had indeed had his fingernails torn out, just to mention one act, after the 1936 officer purges. Anecdote says Stalin bought him a bouquet of flowers from his garden in the way of apology. But still, even in Stalin, we see a duality. in that it is not sufficient to just have violence and coercion. He took great care to shape Soviet propaganda and belief. He was, without a doubt, intelligent, authoring a treatise on socialism and actively designing a system of socialist political conception, criticized by Trotsky as socialism in one country, though this is, in some sense, a misapprehension. If I were the cynical type, I would be tempted to say Stalin embodies the strange duality of the philosopher king. Certainly he was a true believer, and yet in his legacy we find only a fool. He acted out socialist ideas to their conclusion, exterminating groups of elite and reducing a very vibrant and fast-growing Russian empire to ruin. Before and during World War I, Russia was one of the most rapidly industrializing states in Europe, experiencing simultaneous extensive growth in agriculture, owing to the Stolypin reforms, and rapid onset of industrialization. This growth was organic. Meanwhile, the consequences of communism left, after 1990, an economy that was slated for collapse. The ideology itself was fragmented. The lack of an effective post-collapse myth encouraged cynical action and blatant robbery. It is notable that the precise sort of political attitude that characterizes realism pervaded this society, as the Russians became an even more immensely cynical people. Ironically, the cynicism came with a deep sentiment towards the time when the Soviet Union's myth of strong Russia was taken to the extreme, a sentiment which Putin largely hijacked and can be seen as the driving force behind his power. After collapse, much of what was perceived as progress was exposed as a scam, generating little of actual value. Zizek's concept of the big other can be called on here. Whilst deviation from the truth and good order can be segmented away, hidden behind 1,000 little cynicisms, eventually the truth has its due. This happened during Khrushchev's 1956 secret speech. Remember, all successful ideologies see their ideas eventually followed to full conclusion. To return to the regime, the creation of cynical theories of realpolitik serves it well. The regime individualizes and atomizes. Here precisely is where the violence of power manifests itself, not in the relationship of the individual to power on any significant scale. As I said, our elite are foxes, utilizing violence only in scattered ways, but ensuring that each such trifling act is broadcast well. In the UK, there have been numerous examples of people being arrested for innocuous tweets, and the concept of non-crime hate incidents is enshrined into custom. The randomness serves to undermine the legitimacy of opposition, while the small scale is designed to make the violence seem inconsequential and within democratic norms. Similarly, high-profile crackdowns and pervasive psyops, while in some sense real, do more to create a feeling of despondency and mistrust among dissident groups than they ever would in themselves. Their psychological effect is magnified, and action is prevented. A pattern emerges. Use of violence and state strength by those in power is never mass or overt. It does not follow Napoleonic battle. It cannot ever address the needs of a warrior for whom it has nothing but command, as one would a number. Regime violence is notable most expressly because it does so little to interfere with the act of consumption, which is the elite's most powerful weapon, a shackle to which all dissidents are bound. In other words, their goal is to demobilize you. The one area in which the regime actively encourages violence is through the fomenting of ideologies of hatred towards specific demographics. Ideas of reparations or white guilt and culpability exist to create narrative of exceptionalism and white cruelty. This, coupled with the importation of the Third World and their shielding from the legal system, has had predictable results. And here the powers that be find their perfect pincer: demobilization and intellectualization from above, and envy-driven chaos from below. The right is only now seeing through and overcoming this formula, It has awakened to the fact that you cannot sacrifice today for the promise of benevolent compromise tomorrow. Just think, how many times in history has amnesty to illegals been granted on the basis of this being combined with stricter border control? We are also awakening to the importance of culture. Beware those who would sell us too convenient a story that allows you to remain passive, and remember the lesson of Sorel: nothing comes through compromise alone. In history, real change is built on active sacrifice. So in the liberal state, violence is simultaneously all-pervading but minuscule. This paradox, I think, loops us back to our original problem, that of the warrior. For he is violence incarnate. The best media representation of this is Linnaeus, a legate of Caesar's legion, who is known only for his mask. He is faceless, yet when one faces him, one finds not a monster, but a man with complex motivations, drives, and good reason, characterized chiefly by the awareness that he represents a means to an ends. Linnaeus is in this sense the antithesis to liberalism and the NCR, crushing his individuality for the sake of higher good. Whatever one may think of him, the duality is illustrative, as the softness of our regime prevents both soldiers and civilians from ever feeling comfortable in their relationship to force. Yet, for a good system to exist, you need dynamism, you need action. If we ever hope to change our bleak reality, we must come to terms with the horror that lies beyond Linnaeus' mask. The horror that it will be, indeed it must be, a face just as ours. I have, at least to an extent, painted a picture of the relation of violence to the regime and to the right-wing opposition. 3 topics remain to be explored: the possibility of a cohesive right-wing myth beyond Trump, the exploration of a more covert forms of power, namely propaganda, by the ruling elites, and an understanding of how our mindset itself maintains our system through our love of consumption. These topics are coming, if it is within my ability to deliver them. I want to end now on a passage that stays with me from Sorel, which may, I hope, echo in your mind as a warning. In the eyes of our contemporary middle class, everything is admirable which dispels the idea of violence. Our middle class desires to die in peace. After them, the deluge.